Hello, everyone. Today we're joined by Tom from the Galapagos Conservation Trust. And Tom, for the people who don't know about the organization, how would you describe it?
Hi, so Galapagos Conservation Trust, we're a UK-based charity. We're the only sort of charity in the UK that focuses exclusively on the conservation of the Galapagos Islands. So we do most of our fundraising in the UK, although we work with obviously a lot of partners in the Galapagos Islands themselves, and also organisations, other NGOs from other parts of the world. I think the thing about Galapagos is there are so many researchers and organisations working there that one of the things that kind of really characterises conservation in Galapagos is the sort of collaboration that goes on between all the different organisations there. So in terms of what we're raising the money for, it's in some instances it's for our own projects that we run and manage, but also a lot of the time it's to support projects being carried out by other organisations over there. So again, some of those will be international NGOs, some of those will be locally based NGOs, and also individual scientists and researchers as well.
So what was your reason for joining the Galapagos Trust? Like your personal motivation for joining?
So it's a good question. So actually my background is not in conservation. I worked in the travel industry for 15 years, but had had it in my mind for a while that I wanted to basically move into conservation and environment sector. I mean, as part of my previous job, I was lucky enough to travel a lot. So when you travel a lot, I think you start to see more and more the environmental issues all around the world. And one of the places that I was lucky enough to visit was the Galapagos Islands. So that, I guess, planted a bit of a seed. And then kind of coming out of COVID, I was looking to make this career change and saw the opportunity come up. And it felt like a really logical step from travel into conservation because I had that sort of link already.
So when was the organization established?
So 1995 we were set up, yeah. And originally it was founded as the kind of fundraising arm of the Charles Darwin Foundation, which is an organisation on the islands themselves. So initially we were raising funds for them, and then over the years it's kind of broadened out so that, like I say, we now run a lot of our own projects and work with a lot of other organisations as well.
Yeah, so speaking of the project, I was looking at the website, and you can see you're working on maybe more than a dozen projects or so that you're maybe partnering up with other organizations with, or like you said, doing it yourself in your organization. So can you highlight some of the projects that are currently happening and that are interesting to know more about, basically?
Sure, yeah. I mean, like you say, that we've got a lot going on. What tends to happen is you start kind of investigating one thing and then it leads on to others. So when we started kind of looking at shark conservation and how we could protect sharks in Galapagos, so Galapagos Islands is home to sort of one of the biggest concentrations of sharks in the world. You still get these huge schools of hammerhead sharks, you get a lot of whale sharks passing through. And when we started looking into, well, how do you protect the sharks, then that leads on to other things. So you start to discover, okay, well, the sharks are using mangroves as nursery sites. When you start looking at the mangroves, you realise, well, so are rays. And actually, we need to do something to protect the rays as well. Then it leads you in other directions into plastic as well, plastic pollution. And I think the thing that really comes across the longer you sort of work in this field is how interconnected everything is. So at the moment, a lot of our focus is on oceans, and the kind of, I guess the main things we're looking at is firstly marine protection. So you're probably aware that there's now this global target of protecting 30% of land and ocean by 2030. And currently Ecuador, which is the country to which the islands belong, they are on around 19%. So we're kind of supporting them to basically get to that 30% target. Also, like I just mentioned, plastic pollution. So that is obviously a huge global issue, and it's, where do you start with it? So we coordinate basically a network. It's called Pacific Plastics Science to Solutions, and it basically brings together a whole host of different organizations, businesses, NGOs, governments, researchers, all across the kind of Eastern Pacific region. So as well as Galapagos, it's Chile, Peru, and mainland Ecuador. And basically what we've been looking at as part of this is, firstly, where is the plastic coming from? And there's some interesting results. The vast majority of the plastic that washes up in Galapagos originates from outside the marine reserve. So it's mainly Peru, Ecuador, and then also a lot of it comes from maritime sources. So it can come from boats deliberately dumping plastic at sea. It can also come from fisheries. There's a lot of issues around kind of abandoned fishing gear. So wildlife gets tangled up in fishing nets. We have these things now called fish aggregating devices. I don't know if you've heard of them. And basically what it is it's particularly used in tuna fishing. And the fishers will release these. It's almost like a kind of raft. It's quite a primitive structure. And the way it works is that all of the fish are attracted, because it's on the surface, they're attracted to this thing. And then basically the fishing vessels come along and scoop up all the fish. But what's happening is these are being released and they're drifting into the marine reserve where they're not supposed to be. And then when they leave the reserve, then these are being collected. So this is, obviously it's an overfishing issue, but also it's a plastic issue because these things are partially made from plastic. Also, we've identified plastic coming, like I say, from mainland South America. So we found there was a certain river where a lot of this stuff is being washed out to sea and it ends up in Galapagos. So then we start to move from the sources to, okay, well, what are the effects on wildlife and what are the solutions? So the effects on wildlife, fortunately, are fairly unpleasant. You know, I'm sure you've heard of wildlife consuming plastics, microplastics. Like I just said, we're also seeing things getting tangled up in plastic, like turtles and sharks. And even in somewhere as protected as Galapagos, you know, this plastic doesn't respect the boundaries of the marine reserve, so it finds its way to the islands. So then you move on to the solutions, which is, you know, how do we stop this? And there's a whole load of different things we're looking at. So we've been working with shopping malls in the mainland. So there's a few malls now where they're using reusable cups, basically, which has already massively sort of reduced the amount of single-use plastic that's being kind of used in these malls. There are organisations looking at alternatives to fossil fuel plastics, so things like bioplastics, which is a kind of really interesting area. But the big thing currently on our radar is that the Global Plastics Treaty is currently being negotiated at the UN. So the treaty, the aim is to have it done by 2024. So the negotiations are going on at the moment, and the committee is being chaired jointly by Peru and Ecuador. So obviously for us, that's great that Ecuador are involved at such a high level. We have some strong links with the Ecuadorian government. So yeah, well, a lot of what we're doing at the moment is feeding into these negotiations and, you know, recommending what we see as the priorities for this treaty, which is, as with all of these big environmental treaties, you know, it's going to be a real challenge to get all the different countries to agree to it. But yeah, so plastics has been a real focus of ours, certainly the first few months of this year.
So with the plastic, for example, and the UN as well, what is your role in those negotiations? Is it more providing all the information, the data that you guys gather, and like from the local communities as well? Is it that, or is there other ways you kind of assist to these negotiations as well?
Yeah, so it's mainly the sort of, like you say, providing the scientific evidence to back up kind of negotiating positions. So actually just this last week, some of our team were at a conference in Panama for the Our Ocean conference, where we were presenting sort of preliminary results from the last 5 years of our plastic research. We had, we did a presentation, we had a panel. One of the panelists was actually the Ecuadorian vice minister who's co-chairing the negotiations. So basically, yeah, what we're doing is, you know, providing the scientific data and recommendations. So we've submitted a kind of submission to the UN. But yeah, we're in contact with the Ecuadorian government. Also, we have policy contacts in the UK government as well. So we're also, you know, asking them, you know, to sort of, yeah, we're submitting our recommendations to them as well of what we want to see as a result of these negotiations. But referring back to what you're saying about the local community, that is another really key aspect of what we do. And as part of the network I've just been talking about, there's a lot of input as well from local community, from local fishers as well, because you need to get the buy-in of the fishing community in Galapagos as well if you're going to get anywhere with doing things around fishing. So yeah, it's like I say, it's a real collaborative process, and it's all the way from those kind of grassroots all the way up to government level.
And speaking of the local community, you mentioned the use of the mall, the food mall, with the use of less use of plastic. Sorry, how else have you influenced or sort of guided local communities into making a more environmental change?
So I mean, we have a number of projects, some which focus directly on that, but a lot of them that's part of it. So we have a project called Connecting with Nature, which is really focused on enabling local kids in Galapagos to experience, all this amazing nature around them. So sometimes people are surprised to hear that people live in Galapagos at all. It is, so 97% of the islands are national park. And in that remaining 3%, there are a few towns and villages. So there's 4 islands that are inhabited. There's about 32,000 people now, which has grown a lot over the sort of last few decades. But yeah, for a lot of the people who live there, actually seeing all this amazing nature is pretty difficult because they can't afford the tourist boats that go out kind of to all the really pristine sites. And one of the reasons that we think it's important to sort of foster that appreciation of nature is because ultimately those kids are going to grow up to be, stewards of that environment, of that sort of, global biodiversity hotspot. So yeah, we have actually someone who lives out in the Galapagos who's our local outreach and education coordinator. So she does a lot of work with local schools on things like the plastics program, but also on giant tortoise conservation. We have another sort of local project which is a thing called the Gills Club, which is basically looking at engaging local girls in shark science. So it's run by Galapagos Science Centre, and they'll take these girls out to basically, go snorkeling. They'll do laboratory research, and again, it's really interesting because although you think, well, they've grown up in this environment, when they first get in the water, a lot of these kids are really nervous of the wildlife. They've never snorkeled, they've never seen a turtle or a shark or whatever. So it's really trying to give them this opportunity that they wouldn't otherwise get. But it's also about creating the next generation of conservationists, and it's about creating more green jobs in Galapagos for people from the islands. So I guess historically conservation has maybe tended to be something that people from the sort of developed world go out and do to communities, and I think the world has moved on from that now, and it's much more about, well, how do we build capacity locally, how do we transfer knowledge and technology and basically empower these communities to make their own decisions and have the tools and resources to do a lot of this work themselves, and in turn create jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the change can come from within those communities. It's better that they know how to handle. You guys are just guiding them in the direction in order to preserve the islands. And so you have education for local communities and a lot of communication with them. I wonder, what about the tourism sector? Because like you mentioned, you yourself have been there before, and on your website there was a mention of, I think, ethical tourism or responsible tourism. How does that incorporate in your strategy as a trust?
So in Galapagos, one of the things that you see is there's almost this kind of symbiotic relationship between tourism and conservation, and it's a fine line to tread. I guess the point at the moment, particularly, is that the local economy in Galapagos is very heavily dependent on tourism. I think at least pre-pandemic, it was something like 80 or 90% of the income of the islands is based on tourism. So in a way, without the tourists, then you start to lose the incentive to keep up the conservation. I mean, there is already within those inhabited areas I was talking about, there are pressures from that growing population on things like waste management, unsustainable development. Agriculture has an impact on the wildlife, and then on top of that, you've got the tourism impacts. So it's a really tricky balance, and I mean, what we sort of say is that a lot of conservation is funded by tourism, and actually a lot of our supporters are people who've been to the islands. We will always encourage people, if they're going to go all that way, to spend longer there. In terms of the carbon emissions, it's better to go less often for longer, to travel with a tour operator or stay at a hotel that has good sustainability practices. And we have on our website, like you say, some kind of tips and guidelines. Longer term, I think it is in the island's interest to diversify a bit and not be so reliant on tourism, because I think what has happened, is almost like in the same way that an ecosystem needs to be resilient, so does an economic system. And when you get a sudden shock like we had with COVID, that completely decimated the island's economy. It's so reliant. Suddenly the tourists just stopped coming completely. And that in a way illustrates that you're too dependent on one source of income. Actually, we kind of had a project where we stepped in and tried to provide livelihoods to some of those people. So we had a project which is still running but kind of scaled down, called Barcode Galapagos, where we were training up park guides, people who worked in the tourism industry in genetic barcoding techniques, so they could assist us with conservation work while they didn't have any income from tourism. So I think the long-term aspiration, has to be not to get rid of tourism, obviously, but to have an economy that is not so heavily dependent on that one source of income. In terms of managing the tourist numbers, obviously, as with everything, Galapagos is heavily regulated. It's tightly controlled. The landing sites you can go to are limited. You can't go to these sites without a guide and all this kind of thing. But there are issues attached to tourism, and there are issues attached to the cruise tourism, but also to land-based tourism, where that is actually a lot harder in some ways to regulate, because it's a lot easier to kind of Airbnb your spare room than it is to build a cruise ship. So there is an issue there with more hotel rooms, accommodation being added on the land side, which again puts more pressure on things like the wastes and recycling, things like that.
So what about the wildlife, marine wildlife, and on land as well? During COVID, I can imagine that it was going very well with the wildlife in general, because there were less tourists, so they have more space, and to kind of, I guess it would help with the conservation of the wildlife. But then now, since I don't know, 1 or 2 years, all the tourists are probably back, maybe up to 100% now again. Can you see that impact and like how that has flowed in the last couple of years?
I mean, I wouldn't actually say it's quite as black and white as that, because one of the things that happened when the tourism dried up is obviously then people look for other ways to make money and other ways to use the land. So land use is the kind of the key thing, I guess, to look at really on the inhabited islands. And a lot of the issues that we're dealing with on the islands as opposed to in the oceans are to do with human impacts, human wildlife conflicts. So most of the population lives on Santa Cruz Island, and there in the kind of highlands you have this agricultural zone where there are farms, and the giant tortoises, for example, they migrate every year from the highlands to the lowlands and back again. and part of this involves crossing some of this farmland, and so you have these issues with things like, fences that are literally in the way of their migration. You have issues with livestock, and we have examples now of tortoises picking up antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Also, there's an issue with roads and road traffic. Tortoises get hit by cars. So the tourists not being there, while they might have alleviated some pressures, other things perhaps got worse. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of do we have any sort of figures on what's happened since the tourists come back? No, and that's not something we're specifically looking at or that you'd have results on yet. But I'd say the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss on the island are these much bigger things like plastic pollution, like invasive species is a huge problem. So things like rats, goats, feral cats that have been introduced by humans play havoc with the wildlife because they're just not adapted to it. So a lot of the projects we're working on looking at basically removing invasive species and then being able to reintroduce species in some cases have gone extinct locally on certain islands. So that's a big focus. And like I say, working on things like how do you manage waste and how do you make roads safer for tortoises to cross, for example. Things like that are more of our focus, I guess, than specifically tourism, although tourism has an impact on a lot of these issues. We look at the bigger picture, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, what about fundraising? Because you probably rely on that. And like you said, you partner up with a lot of local organizations and also international organizations to help the islands on a higher level. Is your part in those partnerships more focused towards fundraising and funding, or other ways you can assist?
No, not exclusively. No, I mean that is a big part of it, and our fundraising comes from a whole host of sources. I mean, partly it's our members and who do, like I say, tend to be people who've been to the islands, but actually a huge part of it as well is trusts and foundations, charitable foundations, government grants. We have like a online shop. We have a lot of different fundraising streams. It's not just the kind of paying members. Like I say, a lot of it comes from these big funders. But in terms of what we do for our partners, yeah, it's fundraising, but it's also, we are involved in the research, in the science ourselves, in helping to manage the project, in putting people in touch with each other with logistics, helping them with budgeting, things like that, helping them with communications. So we'll, for individual projects, sometimes they'll have their own communications presence, they might have their own website or communications plan will help with that. Career development of early career scientists. There's a load of different stuff, and it kind of depends on the project, really. But yeah, I mean, we get involved. It's not purely a fundraising thing. We get involved in the delivery of the projects as well, and the reporting of them as well. Putting together reports, like I've just been talking about this big plastics report. Last year, we convened a big conference for all of our partners in the plastics program, which happened in Lima in Peru. So yeah, we're involved at basically every level, and actually some of my colleagues are on the islands at the moment, meeting up with all the project partners and getting involved with the projects hands-on. So yeah, it goes all the way through, really.
And for members, they're mostly in the UK, right?
Mm-hmm.
And do you guys use social media, maybe Instagram or YouTube, to communicate not just stories, but show like photos or videos of what's going on there? Or how do you keep the members in the loop with visuals, basically?
Yeah, so we're on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. We have an email newsletter. We also produce a magazine twice a year. So some of our membership are a less tech savvy generation. They prefer printed magazine. Others prefer digital. So we try and cover all those bases. We run events as well. So we normally do at least one webinar a year. We also do in-person events. So our big sort of annual event called Galapagos Day, which happens at the Royal Geographical Society in London. So that's when we get sort of speakers from kind of across our projects and have lectures, and then have the opportunity to sort of network. So yeah, events are an important part of it as well. And yeah, all kinds of other things that come up over the course of the year. We have corporate partners who we do things with. I was just saying, we have sort of relationship with the travel industry as well. So yeah, there's a whole range of stuff we get involved in terms of communication.
What are some of the objectives and goals you guys are working towards in the next couple of years? Like, what's on the horizon?
Yeah, so we have basically review our sort of organizational strategy every 3 years, and we've just basically reviewed that for the next 3 years up to 2025. But we also have our eye on these 2030 goals, which I was talking about earlier. So the big one on, protecting 30% of land and sea. But yeah, I mean, our goals for sort of 2030, I guess, would be getting to that 30% of ocean protection in Ecuador, reducing plastic pollution on the coastlines of Galapagos by 30%. We also want to do more to protect sharks from unsustainable fishing. So those are the kind of key ocean things. And then on the islands, a big focus for us is an island called Floriana. So this is one of those 4 inhabited islands, but it's the one that's probably been the worst affected by human intervention. Big problem there with invasive species. And there's a project that's been going on for a number of years that's basically been preparing for a big eradication of these invasive species, which is due to go ahead later this year. And then, provided that goes well, the plan is then to reintroduce 12 species that are locally extinct sort of over the next few years. So that's a huge project that's, us working with a whole load of other partners, with the Galapagos National Park Directorate, who we work with on, pretty much everything we do there. And that's some really kind of charismatic, iconic species like the Floriana giant tortoise, the Floriana mockingbird. There's a bird called the little vermilion flycatcher, which is a little bright red bird, which is, really popular with anyone who visits the islands and people who live there. So that's a big one on the islands. Also, I've just been talking about with tortoises. We've been basically supporting research for over 10 years now into how the tortoises move around the islands, their health, these sort of migrations, and now we're kind of moving on to how do we basically help with all these problems I was just describing with human wildlife conflict. So that's a big focus of us. And then the other thing we're looking at on the islands, on the inhabited islands, is potentially rewilding abandoned farmland. So a lot of that agricultural zone that we were talking about earlier, there's big issues on the islands with irrigation, with getting water, basically, because it's on the equator. There is a lot of natural water sources. So what happens on Santa Cruz is that basically the water has to be driven from the lowlands up to the highlands in trucks, which is bad for carbon emissions. It's also expensive for the farmers. So we are supporting a project that is basically harvesting fog and rainwater. So they put up these big nets right up in the highlands that catches the water from the fog, sort of drains it off, and then they can use that to irrigate. Also doing a lot of things around hydroponic growing and greenhouses. But what all of this means is that there is a lot of this marginal farmland that just isn't being used for farming. So with the right support, we think some of this could be basically turned over back to nature, then it almost acts as like a buffer zone between the farmland and the national park. So that's something that we're just starting to explore with some of our local partners. But yeah, we'd really like to see that take off over the next sort of 3 to 5 years. So yeah, there's a lot going on. And then again, in the background as well, like I say, there's all these big global treaties as well that we're really keen to, make sure we get kind of strong results from those. I mentioned the plastics treaty. You probably have seen in the news just last weekend, the high seas treaty, the agreement on that's been reached. So that's going to be a big step towards getting that 30% in the ocean. So yeah, it's never quiet here, is the thing I've learned.
That's super interesting. You must have quite a complex and diverse workday, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I mean, like you should see the spreadsheet where we try and plan out our comms on a daily basis. A lot going on, a lot to keep on top of. But yeah, like I said, what tends to happen is you start looking at one issue and then it just branches into all these other things, and you just can't ignore. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on, but they all kind of interconnect.
Amazing. Well, yeah, thank you so much for having the chat. It was super helpful. And if people are interested in learning a bit more about you guys, or maybe becoming a member or doing anything else, where can they go to? Obviously the social media, but
yeah, so if you visit our website, galapagosconservation.org.uk, then you can join as a member. You can donate to our appeals. We also have an online shop. And for those who aren't able to support us financially, which I appreciate at the moment, it's a tough time for a lot of people, you can sign up to our e-newsletter. You can get regular updates from us that way. You can follow us on social media, and yeah, you can help us spread the word. And like I say, a lot of people don't realise that a lot of these issues are affecting Galapagos. It's in everyone's head as a kind of pristine ecosystem, and in many ways it is. It's 97% protected, like I said. But even somewhere like Galapagos is being affected by these big issues like plastic pollution, climate change, unsustainable fishing. Even somewhere like Galapagos is being affected. So I sort of think, if you can't protect that Galapagos, where can you protect? So that's what's really important.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, now it all comes together now, how much you guys are doing to protect, like you said, this very precious ecosystem. So yeah, thank you so much for chatting with us, and yeah, letting us in the busy and hectic world. Yeah.
Oh, no worries. Well, thanks for inviting us along. It's been great to chat to you.